The iron shackles bit into Teresa Collins's wrists as her cousin Raymond shoved her through the door of McKinnon's trading post, his eyes glazed with desperation and something darker she had never seen in him before. The morning sun hung low over Gunnison, Colorado, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. It was June of 1876, and the town still buzzed with tales of Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn just weeks earlier. Teresa had arrived in Gunnison only 3 months ago, traveling from St. Louis after her parents succumbed to cholera. Raymond, her mother's nephew, had been her only living relative willing to take her in. She should have known better than to trust a man who spent more time at the saloon than tending his failing ranch. "Please, Raymond," Teresa whispered, her voice cracking. "Do not do this. I can work harder. I can help you rebuild." Raymond would not meet her eyes. His hands trembled as he pushed her toward the counter where Marcus McKinnon stood, his weathered face impassive. McKinnon was known throughout the territory as a man who dealt in everything, from beaver pelts to human lives, though most folks pretended not to notice the latter. "I need supplies," Raymond said, his voice hoarse. "Enough to get me through to Denver." "I have got nothing left, McKinnon. The ranch is lost. Drought killed my cattle, and the bank is coming for the land." McKinnon's cold eyes traveled over Teresa, assessing her like livestock. She was 20 years old, with dark chestnut hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and green eyes that now burned with fury and fear. Her calico dress was worn but clean, and despite the hardships of recent months, she stood straight-backed, her chin lifted in defiance. "She looks healthy enough," McKinnon said, walking around her in a slow circle. "Can she cook?" "So?" "I am not property," Teresa spat, jerking against Raymond's grip. "This is illegal. You cannot sell a person in Colorado. The war ended that." McKinnon laughed, a dry sound like rattling bones. "Out here, miss, the law is whatever we make it. You got no papers, no proof of who you are. Your cousin here says you owe him a debt for taking you in. That makes you an indentured servant, far as anyone is concerned." "Indentured for what? 3 months of room and board?" Teresa's voice rose. "Raymond, my mother would curse you from her grave for this." Raymond finally looked at her, and she saw tears mixing with the shame in his bloodshot eyes. "I am sorry, Teresa. I truly am. But I got to survive." "You understand survival, don't you?" Before she could answer, the door swung open behind them, bringing with it a gust of mountain air and the jingle of spurs. Teresa turned to see a man step into the trading post, and despite her dire circumstances, something in her chest tightened at the sight of him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck beneath a dusty black Stetson, and his jaw was shadowed with several days of stubble. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep brown, almost amber in the shaft of sunlight streaming through the window, and filled with an intelligence that seemed at odds with the rough exterior. He wore a simple work shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing tanned, muscular forearms and a pair of well-worn leather chaps over his denim trousers. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster tied down in the manner of a man who knew how to use it. The stranger's gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with an expression that shifted from neutral to carefully controlled anger. "Morning, McKinnon," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I see you are conducting your usual business." "Trent Foster," McKinnon replied, his tone cooler now. "Did not expect to see you back in Gunnison so soon. Thought you were driving cattle up to Wyoming." "Finished early," Trent said. He moved closer, his eyes never leaving Teresa. "What is happening here?" "Private transaction," Raymond interjected nervously. "Nothing to concern you, mister." Trent's eyes flicked to Raymond, then back to Teresa. She could see him taking in the shackles, her pale face, the set of her jaw that was equal parts fear and fury. Something passed across his features, recognition perhaps, or remembrance of something painful. "That's so," Trent said quietly, "because from where I am standing, it looks like you are selling a woman like she is a sack of grain." She is indentured, McKinnon said, his hand dropping casually to rest near the pistol at his belt. Legal and proper. Her cousin here holds her debt. How much? Trent asked. The question hung in the air. Teresa felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not know this man, had no reason to trust him, but something in his steady gaze made her want to hope. How much for what? McKinnon asked carefully. For the supplies you were about to give him. For the debt, how much for all of it? Raymond's eyes widened with sudden greed. Well, now that would be. $50 in supplies, McKinnon interrupted, shooting Raymond a warning look. That is what we agreed upon. Trent nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. I will give you $75 in gold coin. The supplies go to him as agreed. The woman's debt is paid, and she goes free. Teresa could not breathe. $75 was a fortune, more than most men made in 3 months of hard labor. Why would a stranger offer such a sum? McKinnon's eyes gleamed with avarice, but suspicion lurked there too. That is generous, Foster. What is your interest in the girl? That is my business, Trent said flatly. He counted out the gold coins onto the counter, each one clinking against the wood with finality. Do we have a deal, or do I take my money elsewhere and mention to Sheriff Dawson what I saw here today? The threat was clear. McKinnon might operate in moral shadows, but he still needed to maintain some veneer of respectability. A complaint from Trent Foster, who Teresa was beginning to realize must be someone of standing in the community, could cause real problems. Deal, McKinnon said, scooping up the coins with practiced speed. He pulled a key from his vest pocket and tossed it to Trent. The shackles are yours to remove. Raymond, your supplies will be ready in 10 minutes. Raymond started to protest, perhaps hoping for a share of the excess money, but one look from Trent silenced him. He slunk toward the back of the store, avoiding Teresa's gaze. Trent moved to Teresa, the key held out where she could see it. May I? He asked, his voice gentler now. She nodded, not trusting her voice. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he unlocked the shackles, and she caught the scent of leather and sage and something else, wood smoke, perhaps. The metal fell away from her wrists, and she saw the raw, red marks it had left behind. Trent's jaw tightened as he saw the abraded skin. Did he hurt you otherwise? No, Teresa managed. Just dragged me here this morning before I fully understood what he meant to do. Your things? Do you have belongings at his ranch? A carpet bag. Some clothes, a few letters from my mother. Nothing of value except to me. Trent nodded. He called over his shoulder without looking away from her. McKinnon, add paper and pencil to Raymond's supplies. Then, to Teresa, you will write down exactly what belongs to you. I will make sure it is delivered to you. Where? Teresa asked, finding her voice at last. Where would you deliver them? I have nowhere to go now. You can stay at the boarding house, Trent said. Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable place. I will pay for a room for a month. That will give you time to figure out what comes next. Teresa stared at him. Why? Why would you do this for a stranger? For the first time, she saw something flicker in those amber eyes' pain, perhaps, or the ghost of an old wound. Because 5 years ago, I watched my sister sold the same way by our stepfather after our mother died. I was 16, too young, and too poor to stop it. By the time I earned enough money and tracked down where he had sold her, she was already gone, died of fever in a mining camp, being worked to death by the man who bought her. The words hit Teresa like a physical blow. She saw the truth of them etched in every line of his face, the tension in his shoulders. This was not just charity. This was atonement, or perhaps justice denied coming full circle. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so very sorry for your loss. Do not be sorry, Trent said. Just be free. Make the choice she never got to make. Teresa felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of McKinnon and her traitor of a cousin. Thank you, she said instead. I do not know how to repay such kindness. No repayment needed, Trent replied. He turned to the counter where McKinnon had grudgingly provided paper and pencil. Write your list. Be specific. If Raymond tries to keep anything, I will know. Teresa took the pencil with shaking hands and began to write. Her possessions were few enough. 2 dresses, one for everyday wear and one for Sunday services, a shawl her mother had knitted, underthings, a hairbrush, the packet of letters tied with ribbon, and a small Bible with her family names inscribed inside. As she wrote, she was aware of Trent standing beside her, a solid presence between her and the rest of the room. When she finished, Trent took the list and folded it carefully. He walked to where Raymond was hovering near the supply shelves and thrust the paper at him. You will bring these items to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house by sunset today. Every single thing on this list, in the same condition they are in now. If anything is missing or damaged, I will come looking for you. Are we clear? Raymond paled. Now see here, I have rights. You have no rights where she is concerned. Not anymore. Her debt is paid, and you have your supplies. Take them and be grateful I do not drag you to the sheriff for attempted slavery. Trent's voice was low and dangerous, and Raymond seemed to shrink in on himself. Fine, Raymond muttered. Fine. I will bring her damned things. Trent turned back to Teresa and offered his arm like a gentleman at a social. Shall we? Teresa hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his forearm. She could feel the solid muscle beneath the fabric, the strength there, but also the care with which he moderated his movements so as not to jostle her. They walked out of the trading post together, leaving behind the smell of animal pelts and human misery. The morning sun was higher now, warming the wooden sidewalks of Gunnison's main street. Teresa blinked in the brightness, feeling as though she had emerged from a cave or a nightmare. People passed by miners heading toward the mountains, women with shopping baskets, a group of cowboys laughing outside the saloon. Normal life continuing as if her world had not just been upended twice in the space of an hour. Mrs. Henderson's place is just down the street, Trent said, guiding her gently. She is a good woman. Widowed in the war, came out here with her son about 8 years ago. She will take care of you. And you? Teresa asked. What do you do here in Gunnison? I have a ranch about 10 miles north of town, Trent explained. Cattle mostly, some horses. I run a small operation, just me and 2 hands, who help during branding and driving season. I come into town every few weeks for supplies or to deliver stock. Is that what brought you to McKinnon's today? Supplies? Trent's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. Actually, I was supposed to meet him to discuss buying some tack. Lucky timing, I suppose. Lucky. Teresa wondered if it was luck or something else. Providence. Fate. The answer to a prayer she had not even had time to form. They stopped in front of a 2-story house painted white with green shutters. A neat garden grew along the front, colorful with summer blooms, and a sign hung by the door reading, Henderson's Boarding House Respectable Lodgings. Trent knocked, and a moment later, the door opened to reveal a handsome woman in her 40s, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple but well-made dress of blue gingham, and her face was kind but firm, the face of a woman who had seen hardship but refused to let it break her. Trent Foster, she said, surprised. What brings you by, and who is this? Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Teresa Collins. She is in need of a room and some kindness. I would like to pay for a month's lodging for her and possibly help with finding her work if you know of any opportunities. Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes took in Teresa's appearance, the marks on her wrists, the fear still lingering in her eyes, the way she stood close to Trent as if he were a shield. Teresa saw understanding dawn in the older woman's face. Of course, Mrs. Henderson said warmly, stepping back to let them in. Come in, dear. You look like you could use some tea and a quiet place to sit. The interior of the boarding house was clean and welcoming, with lace curtains and solid furniture that spoke of care and pride. The smell of fresh bread wafted from somewhere in the back. I have a room on the second floor, Mrs. Henderson continued. It overlooks the garden. Quiet. Meals are included: breakfast at 7, supper at 6. I do not allow drinking or loose behavior, but I think you will find it comfortable. It sounds wonderful, Teresa said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you both so much. Trent pulled out his wallet and counted bills onto the table near the door. For the month, an extra for any necessities Miss Collins might need. Clothes, shoes, whatever she requires. Trent, that is too much, Teresa started, but he shook his head. It is what is right, he said simply. Mrs. Henderson, her belongings will be delivered this evening. A carpet bag from her cousin. Make sure everything on this list arrives. He handed over a copy of the list he had made Teresa write. I will check every item personally, Mrs. Henderson promised. Trent turned to Teresa, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. She saw the pain of old wounds in his eyes, but also something else, a flicker of curiosity, of interest that went beyond simple charity. Her heart skipped unexpectedly. You will be safe here, he said. If you need anything, Mrs. Henderson knows how to reach me. And Miss Collins, Teresa, you are free now. That means the choices ahead are yours alone. Do not let anyone take that from you again. I will not, Teresa promised. And Trent, Mr. Foster, I owe you a debt I can never repay. You owe me nothing, he said, but his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer before he settled his hat back on his head and turned toward the door. Good day, ladies. When the door closed behind him, Teresa felt suddenly bereft, as if a light had been extinguished. Mrs. Henderson touched her arm gently. That is a good man, she said. One of the best I have known. His sister's death near broke him, but he built himself back up through honest work and honest living. You could do worse than having him as a friend. I barely know him, Teresa said, but her cheeks warmed. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. Time has a way of changing that. Now let me show you to your room, and then we will have that tea, and you can tell me as much or as little as you want about how you came to be in Trent Foster's care. The room was indeed lovely, with a brass bed covered in a white quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a window that looked out over the garden. Teresa stood at that window for a long time after Mrs. Henderson left her to settle in, watching the mountains in the distance and trying to process everything that had happened. This morning she had woken in her cousin's drafty ranch house, planning to spend the day mending fence line and tending the scraggly vegetable garden she had coaxed into existence despite the drought. Now she was free but adrift, with no family and no prospects, dependent on the charity of strangers. And yet, when she thought of Trent Foster's steady gaze and gentle hands unlocking her shackles, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else entirely: hope, perhaps, or the beginning of something that might one day become more. She was still standing at the window when she heard the sound of horses in the street. Looking down, she saw Raymond arriving with her carpet bag, looking sullen and defeated. Mrs. Henderson met him at the door, and even from her window, Teresa could see the older woman's imperious posture as she checked through the bag's contents against the list. Apparently satisfied, Mrs. Henderson took the bag and dismissed Raymond with a curt nod that spoke volumes about her opinion of men who would sell their kin. A few minutes later, there was a knock on Teresa's door, and Mrs. Henderson entered with the carpet bag. Everything is here, she reported, including these. She held out the packet of letters, tied with faded pink ribbon. Teresa took them with trembling hands. These were her last connection to her mother, to the life she had known before cholera and desperation and that terrible morning at the trading post. She clutched them to her chest, finally allowing the tears she had held back to fall. Mrs. Henderson sat beside her on the bed and put an arm around her shoulders, saying nothing, simply offering the comfort of another woman's presence. They sat that way for a long time while Teresa cried out her fear, her grief, her gratitude, and her confusion about the future. Finally, when the tears subsided, Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "You are going to be all right. I have seen women come through worse than this and build good lives. You are young and strong, and you have spirit. I can see it in you. Gunnison may not be St. Louis, but it is a good town full of decent people. You will find your place here." "I hope you are right," Teresa whispered. "I am always right," Mrs. Henderson said with a small smile. "Just ask my son. Now wash your face and come down for tea. You need food and rest. Tomorrow will be time enough to think about what comes next." The next 3 days passed in a strange sort of peace. Teresa slept in a real bed, ate regular meals, and slowly began to feel human again. Mrs. Henderson kept her busy with small tasks around the boarding house, helping with laundry, polishing silver, assisting with meal preparation. It was work, but it was honest work done in safety, and Teresa found herself grateful for the routine. She learned that Mrs. Henderson's son James was a clerk at the mining company office, a serious young man of 25 who tipped his hat politely to Teresa at meals but kept his distance, respecting her need for space. The other boarders were an assortment of miners, a school teacher, and an older gentleman who worked at the bank. All were respectful, and Mrs. Henderson made it clear that her house ran on strict principles of propriety. But despite the peace, Teresa found her thoughts returning again and again to Trent Foster. She would see a rider pass the house, and her heart would leap, hoping it might be him. She replayed their conversation in the trading post, the feel of his hands gently removing her shackles, the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his sister. She told herself she was being foolish. He had shown her kindness, nothing more. He had his ranch to run and his own life to live. He would not return. On the 4th day, she was proven wrong. Teresa was in the garden, helping Mrs. Henderson stake tomato plants, when she heard the sound of a horse in the street. She looked up and felt her breath catch. Trent sat astride a beautiful bay gelding, his hat tipped back and his face relaxed in a way it had not been at the trading post. When he saw her, he dismounted in one fluid motion and looped the reins over the hitching post. "Miss Collins," he greeted, touching the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes twinkling. "We were just finishing up here. Teresa, why do not you offer Mr. Foster some lemonade? I made fresh this morning." Before Teresa could respond, Mrs. Henderson had bustled back into the house, leaving them alone in the garden. Teresa wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of her simple work dress and the tendrils of hair that had escaped her bun. "How have you been?" Trent asked. His eyes scanned her face as if checking for signs of distress. "Well," Teresa said honestly, "better than I have been in a long time, thanks to you. Mrs. Henderson has been very kind." "She is good at that," Trent agreed. He seemed slightly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I hope you do not mind my stopping by. I was in town and wanted to check that you were settling in." "I do not mind at all," Teresa said quickly. "In fact, I am glad you came. I have been wanting to thank you properly for what you did." "You already thanked me." "Not enough. You changed the entire course of my life in the space of a few minutes. That deserves more than a hasty thank you in a trading post." Trent smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from handsome to something more. "Then you are welcome, properly and thoroughly." Teresa laughed, surprised by the sound. She had not laughed since before her parents died. "Would you like that lemonade? We could sit on the porch." "I would like that very much." They settled into the rocking chairs on Mrs. Henderson's front porch, glasses of tart sweet lemonade in hand. The afternoon was warm but not oppressive, with a breeze carrying down from the mountains. For a few moments they sat in companionable silence, watching the town go about its business. "Tell me about your ranch," Teresa said finally. "What is it like?" Trent's face brightened. "It is beautiful country, high valley with a creek running through it. The grass is good and there is shelter from the worst weather. I started with 50 head of cattle 5 years ago. Now I am up to 300 plus a dozen horses." "You built all that in 5 years?" "With help," Trent said. And a lot of hard work. Some luck, too. I bought the land from a prospector who struck gold and wanted to move to Denver. Got it for a good price because the cabin needed work. Spent my first winter rebuilding the place while sleeping in a tent. That must have been difficult. It was. Trent's expression grew distant. But I needed something to build, something to focus on. After my sister died, I felt like I was drowning in anger and grief. The ranch gave me purpose. Teresa understood that need for purpose all too well. What was her name, your sister? Sarah, Trent said softly. She was 2 years younger than me, brave and stubborn and full of fire. Our stepfather sold her to a mine owner who was looking for a cook and cleaner. Claimed she owed him for her upkeep after our mother passed. I tried to stop him, but I was just a kid. He had me thrown in jail for 3 days on some trumped-up charge. By the time I got out, Sarah was gone. How did you find out what happened to her? Took me 2 years to track down the mine. When I got there, they told me she had died 6 months earlier. Fever. They buried her in an unmarked grave on the hillside with a dozen other workers who had died that winter. Trent's hands tightened around his glass. I wanted to kill him, my stepfather. I tracked him down even. Found him in a saloon in Kansas, drunk and losing at cards. I had my gun drawn, fully intending to shoot him where he sat. What stopped you? Teresa asked quietly. I thought about what Sarah would want. She always said violence just bred more violence. She would have hated me becoming a killer, even if it was to avenge her. Trent looked at Teresa, his eyes haunted. So I walked away, came to Colorado instead, and started over. Some days I wonder if I made the right choice. Teresa reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. You did. Your sister was right, and she would be proud of the man you have become, the life you have built. Trent looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. Something sparked between them, an awareness that made Teresa's pulse quicken. She should pull her hand back, should remember that she barely knew this man, but she could not seem to move. You remind me of her, Trent said. That same fire, same refusal to be broken. I do not feel very strong, Teresa admitted. Most of the time, I feel lost. Being lost and being broken are not the same thing. You will find your way. Before Teresa could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the door with a knowing smile. Teresa, dear, I hate to interrupt, but I need your help with supper preparations. Teresa reluctantly pulled her hand back. Of course, I will be right there. Trent stood, setting down his empty glass. I should be heading back anyway. It is a long ride, and I have chores to finish before dark. Will you come back? Teresa asked, then felt her cheeks heat. That sounded too forward, too eager. But Trent's smile was warm. If you would like me to. I would, Teresa said simply. Then I will, next week when I come to town. Maybe I could take you to dinner at the hotel? Teresa's heart soared. I would like that. It is a date, then. Trent retrieved his hat and settled it on his head. Until next week, Miss Collins. Teresa, she corrected. Please call me Teresa. Teresa, he repeated, and the way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. Until next week, Teresa. She watched him mount his horse and ride away, unable to keep the smile from her face. When she finally turned to go inside, she found Mrs. Henderson watching her with approval. That, the older woman said, is how it begins. How what begins? Teresa asked, though she knew exactly what Mrs. Henderson meant. Everything, Mrs. Henderson replied. Everything that matters. The week that followed was the longest of Teresa's life. She threw herself into work, helping Mrs. Henderson with every task she could find. She learned that Mrs. Henderson was looking for someone to help run the boarding house as her arthritis was making the physical work increasingly difficult. The position would come with room, board, and a small salary, not much, but enough for Teresa to begin saving and planning for her future. I would be honored to help, Teresa said, when Mrs. Henderson broached the subject. "You have done so much for me. This would be my chance to repay some of that kindness." "You have already been a help," Mrs. Henderson said, "and you have a good head for organization. I think we will work well together." The days fell into a pleasant rhythm, but Teresa counted down the hours until she would see Trent again. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking of her too, whether she was foolish to feel this way about a man she barely knew. But she could not deny the connection she felt, the way her world had shifted on its axis the moment he walked into that trading post. She told herself to be cautious, to guard her heart, but it was already too late for that. When the day finally arrived, Teresa took extra care with her appearance. She wore her Sunday dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her hair up in a style she had learned from a magazine Mrs. Henderson kept in the parlor. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she saw a woman who looked hopeful for the first time in months. Trent arrived promptly at 6, looking freshly bathed and shaved, wearing a clean white shirt and a black vest. He held his hat in his hands as Mrs. Henderson let him in, and his eyes lit up when he saw Teresa descending the stairs. "You look beautiful," he said, then cleared his throat as if surprised by his own boldness. "Thank you," Teresa replied, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "You look very handsome yourself." Mrs. Henderson shooed them toward the door with barely concealed delight. "Go on, enjoy your evening. Teresa, be back by 9. "Yes, madam," Teresa said dutifully. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Gunnison, with white tablecloths and real china. Trent held out her chair, and Teresa sat, feeling like she had stepped into a different world. It had been so long since she had been treated like a lady, since she had dined somewhere nicer than a crowded boarding house table. They ordered roast beef and potatoes, and as they waited for their food, they talked. Teresa found herself telling Trent about her life before Gunnison, her childhood in St. Louis, her father's work as a pharmacist, the way her mother's flower garden had been the pride of their neighborhood. She told him about her parents' deaths, the devastating speed with which cholera had taken them, the way Raymond had seemed like her salvation, until the money ran out and desperation turned him cruel. Trent listened with complete attention, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she faltered over the painful parts, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You have been through more than anyone should have to bear," he said. "But you survived it. That takes real strength." "Sometimes I do not feel strong," Teresa confessed. "Sometimes I feel like I am just barely holding together." "That is what strength is," Trent said. "Not the absence of fear or pain, but continuing on despite it." Teresa squeezed his hand. "Tell me more about your ranch. What is a typical day like?" Trent's face brightened, and he began describing his daily routine, rising before dawn to tend the horses, checking the herd, mending fence, the endless work of keeping a ranch running. He spoke with such passion about the land, the animals, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, that Teresa found herself captivated. "It sounds like paradise," she said wistfully. "It can be hard, too," Trent admitted. "Lonely sometimes, especially in winter when the snow keeps me close to the cabin, but I would not trade it for anything." Their food arrived, and they continued talking through the meal, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Teresa learned that Trent was 26, that he had taught himself to read using his sister's old school books, that his favorite time of day was early morning when the sun first touched the mountains. He learned that Teresa loved to sing, that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, that she missed the Mississippi River and the sound of steamboat whistles. By the time they finished dinner and Trent walked her back to the boarding house, Teresa felt as though she had known him for years rather than days. There was an ease between them, a comfort that went beyond their dramatic first meeting. They stood on Mrs. Henderson's porch, reluctant to say goodnight. The sun had set, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere down the street, a piano played in one of the saloons, the music drifting on the evening air. "I had a wonderful time," Teresa said softly. "So did I." Trent hesitated, then said, Teresa, I know we have not known each other long, but I would like to keep seeing you, if you are agreeable to that. I am very agreeable, Teresa replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. Then maybe I could take you on a picnic next Sunday. I could show you some of the countryside around my ranch. I would love that. Trent reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. Teresa's breath caught at the tenderness of the gesture. Good night, Teresa, he said quietly. Good night, Trent. She watched him walk to his horse, mount up, and ride away into the gathering darkness. When she finally went inside, Mrs. Henderson was waiting with a cup of tea and an expectant expression. Well? The older woman asked. It was perfect, Teresa said, and she could not stop smiling. Over the following weeks, Teresa and Trent fell into a pattern. He would come to town twice a week, and they would spend every moment they could together. He took her on that promised picnic, spreading a blanket by a creek while his horse grazed nearby, and they talked for hours while the water burbled over stones. He showed her wildflowers she had never seen before, taught her the names of the peaks that ringed the valley, pointed out where elk sometimes came down from the high country. Teresa found herself falling in love with the land almost as much as she was falling in love with the man. The mountains were different from anything she had known in Saint Louis, wild and majestic and somehow alive, in a way that made her feel small and significant all at once. But mostly, she was falling in love with Trent. She loved his quiet strength, the way he listened when she spoke, the gentleness in his hands despite the calluses from hard work. She loved how he never tried to rush her, never pressed for more than she was ready to give. He courted her with old-fashioned respect, and it made her trust him in a way she had not thought possible after Raymond's betrayal. One Sunday afternoon, about 2 months after they had first met, Trent drove her out to his ranch in a wagon. Teresa's heart pounded with anticipation as they crested a rise, and she saw it for the first time. The cabin sat in a high valley, just as he had described, with mountains rising on 3 sides and a creek threading through the grassland. The cabin itself was solid and well built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A barn stood nearby, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. It was beautiful and somehow exactly what she had imagined. What do you think? Trent asked, and she heard the nervousness in his voice. It is wonderful, Teresa breathed. Trent, it is absolutely wonderful. He smiled, relief evident on his face. Come on, let me show you inside. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a bedroom and a small loft that Trent said he used for storage. The furniture was rough-hewn but sturdy, clearly made by his own hands. What struck Teresa most was how clean and orderly everything was. This was not a bachelor living in squalor, but a man who took pride in his home. I know it is not fancy, Trent said, watching her take it all in. It is perfect, Teresa said honestly. You have built something really special here. They spent the afternoon together, and Trent showed her around the property. He introduced her to his ranch hands, 2 brothers named Carl and Peter, who lived in a small bunkhouse near the barn. They were polite but kept their distance, clearly respecting their boss's privacy. Teresa watched Trent work with the horses, admiring his easy confidence and the way the animals responded to his gentle handling. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the valley, they sat together on the porch steps. Trent's arm was around Teresa's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. Teresa, Trent said quietly, I need to tell you something. She looked up at him, alarmed by the serious tone. What is it? I am in love with you, he said, meeting her eyes steadily. I know it is fast, and maybe I should wait longer to say it, but I do not want to hide how I feel. You have become the most important person in my life. When I am not with you, I am thinking about you. When I am with you, everything feels right in a way it never has before. Teresa's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. I love you too, she whispered. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you might think I was just grateful for what you did, that I might be confusing gratitude with love. And now? Trent asked. Now I know the difference. What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with who you are. Your kindness, your strength, your goodness, the way you make me laugh, the way I feel safe when I am with you, the way my heart beats faster when I see you riding into town. Teresa took a shaky breath. I love you, Trent Foster, completely and truly. Trent cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. May I kiss you? Please, Teresa said. He lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Teresa's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss deepened, and she felt herself melting into him, all the loneliness and fear of the past months falling away in the face of this perfect moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Trent rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Teresa's eyes widened. What? I know it is sudden, but I am sure I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Marry me, Teresa. Be my wife. Help me build this ranch into something we can pass on to our children. Grow old with me in this valley. Teresa's heart felt like it might burst. Yes, she said, laughing through new tears. Yes, of course I will marry you. Trent kissed her again, and this time there was joy in it, celebration and relief and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Gunnison. Mrs. Henderson stood up as Teresa's matron of honor, weeping openly throughout the ceremony. Carl and Peter served as witnesses, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday best. The minister was an elderly man who had known Trent since he first came to the territory and who spoke movingly about second chances and new beginnings. Teresa wore a new dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Trent wore a new black suit that made him look impossibly handsome. When he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and when Teresa said hers, she meant every word with her whole heart. The small congregation cheered when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Trent kissed her in front of them all, not caring who saw his joy. The townspeople had organized a reception at the church hall, with food and fiddle music and dancing. Teresa danced with her new husband, her head resting on his shoulder, and felt happier than she had ever thought possible. This was not the life she had imagined growing up in St. Louis, but it was better, realer somehow, and entirely hers. As the evening drew to a close, Trent helped Teresa into the wagon, and they rode out to the ranch under a canopy of stars. The night air was cool and sweet, and Teresa snuggled close to her husband's side. Are you happy? Trent asked. Happier than I can say, Teresa replied. Are you? More than I thought I could be, Trent said. When I lost Sarah, I thought my capacity for happiness died with her. But you brought it back, Teresa. You gave me something to hope for again. We will name our first daughter after her, Teresa said impulsively. If you would like that. Trent's arm tightened around her. I would like that very much. The cabin was warm when they arrived, a fire burning in the hearth that Carl must have started for them. Someone, probably Mrs. Henderson, had brought over fresh flowers, and they sat in a vase on the table, filling the room with their scent. Trent carried Teresa over the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. He set her down gently in front of the fire, and for a moment they simply stood looking at each other, taking in the reality of what they had just done. I am your wife, Teresa said wonderingly. And I am your husband, Trent replied, for the rest of our lives. He kissed her then, and the kiss held all the promise of their wedding vows. Teresa gave herself over to it, to him, to the future they would build together. Whatever hardships might come, they would face them together. She was no longer alone, no longer adrift. She had found her home, and it was here in this mountain valley, in the arms of the man who had saved her and then loved her. That night, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Trent held Teresa close and whispered promises against her hair. He promised to love her, to protect her, to build a life with her that honored both their pasts and their hopes for the future. And Teresa promised the same, her heart full to overflowing with love for this good, gentle man who had seen her at her lowest moment and offered her not just freedom, but a future. The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Teresa learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the constant work that came with tending animals and land. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to churn butter, to tend the vegetable garden she planted behind the cabin. She learned to ride a horse, at first terrified and then exhilarated by the freedom of it. Trent was a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always encouraging her progress. He taught her how to handle the chickens she insisted on getting, how to read the weather by the clouds over the mountains, how to tell when a cow was about to calve. In turn, Teresa brought her own skills to the ranch. She organized the cabin with an efficiency that impressed Trent, sewed curtains for the windows, planted flowers around the porch. She started keeping careful records of the ranch's expenses and income, her neat handwriting filling the ledger Trent had neglected. But it was not just work. They found time for joy too. On Sunday afternoons, they would ride out together, exploring the high country, picnicking by alpine lakes, discovering hidden meadows carpeted with wildflowers. Trent taught Teresa to fish, and she surprised him by catching a trout on her first try. They lay on their backs in the grass, watching clouds drift by, and talked about their dreams for the ranch, for the family they hoped to have. At night, in the intimacy of their bed, they learned each other in ways that went beyond words. Teresa discovered that Trent could be playful, teasing her until she laughed, and passionate in ways that took her breath away. He was always gentle, always attentive to her needs, and she felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. By October, Teresa suspected she was pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be sure before telling Trent, and when she finally did, his joy was unmistakable. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing, and then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands on her shoulders. "As sure as I can be," Teresa said. "I think the baby will come in late May or early June." "A spring baby," Trent said wonderingly. "Our child." "Are you happy?" Teresa asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "I am beyond happy," Trent said. "You have given me everything, Teresa. Everything I thought I had lost." Winter came to the high country with dramatic beauty. Snow fell in thick blankets, transforming the valley into a wonderland of white. The cattle had been moved to lower pastures, and Carl and Peter had gone to spend the winter with family in town, leaving Trent and Teresa alone in their mountain refuge. At first, Teresa worried about the isolation, but she quickly came to love these quiet months. They were snowed in for days at a time, but the cabin was warm and well stocked with provisions. Trent spent his time doing indoor work, mending tack, planning for spring, reading aloud to Teresa from the books she had brought from Mrs. Henderson's lending library. Teresa sewed baby clothes, her hands creating tiny gowns and blankets, while Trent built a cradle from pine wood. He carved careful patterns into the wood flowers and mountains, and a small horse, each detail perfect. Watching him work, his face focused and his hands sure, Teresa felt her love for him deepen even further. "What if I am not a good mother?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands resting on her growing belly. "You will be," Trent said with complete confidence. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I know. Our child will be lucky to have you." "And lucky to have you as a father," Teresa said. "You will teach them to be strong and kind, just like you." "I hope so," Trent said quietly. "I want to give our children everything I could not give Sarah. Safety, stability, love. I want them to never doubt that they are wanted and valued." "They will know," Teresa promised. "We will make sure they know." Christmas came, and Teresa and Trent celebrated alone in their cabin. They exchanged simple gifts. Teresa gave Trent a new shirt she had sewn, and he gave her a pair of leather gloves lined with rabbit fur to keep her hands warm. But the greatest gift was simply being together, building their life one day at a time. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Teresa's pregnancy became more obvious. Her body changed in ways that sometimes frustrated her, but Trent never failed to tell her she was beautiful. When she complained about her swollen ankles or her inability to see her feet, he would rub her back and make her laugh with his gentle teasing. In early April, Carl and Peter returned to the ranch, and work began in earnest to prepare for the busy season ahead. The cattle were brought back to higher pastures, and Trent began the process of branding the new calves. Teresa watched from the porch, one hand on her belly, marveling at how much her life had changed in less than a year. She thought sometimes about Raymond, wondering where he was and whether he ever thought about what he had done. She hoped he had found some peace, but she also hoped he understood the enormity of his betrayal. Mostly, though, she did not think about him at all. That part of her life was over, a dark chapter closed forever. In late May, when the valley was lush with new grass and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Teresa went into labor. Trent rode hard for town to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, while Carl stayed with Teresa, looking absolutely terrified at the prospect of delivering a baby, if it came to that. Fortunately, Trent and Mrs. Patterson arrived in time, and the older woman shooed Carl out of the cabin with instructions to keep the water hot and stay out of the way. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Teresa thought she could not bear another contraction. But Mrs. Patterson was experienced and reassuring, and Trent held her hand through it all, whispering encouragement and love. Finally, as the sun set on a beautiful spring evening, their daughter was born. She came into the world with a lusty cry, and when Mrs. Patterson placed the tiny, red-faced bundle in Teresa's arms, Teresa wept with joy and exhaustion. "She's perfect," Teresa whispered, examining the tiny fingers and toes, the dark fuzz of hair on her head. Trent sat beside her on the bed, one arm around his wife and one finger gently touching his daughter's cheek. His eyes were wet with tears he did not bother to hide. "Sarah," he said softly. "Welcome to the world, little Sarah." The baby seemed to calm at the sound of his voice, her dark eyes trying to focus on this new world she had entered. Teresa looked at her husband and saw everything they had been through together reflected in his face, the pain of the past, the joy of the present, the hope for the future. "She has your eyes," Teresa said. "And your nose," Trent replied, making Teresa laugh. Mrs. Patterson cleaned up efficiently, gave Teresa instructions for nursing and recovery, and then tactfully excused herself to sleep in the spare loft, leaving the new parents alone with their daughter. That night, Teresa lay in bed with Sarah nestled in the crook of her arm and Trent's arm around them both. She had never felt so complete, so utterly at peace. This was what she had been moving toward all along. She realized through loss and hardship, through fear and salvation, to this moment of perfect love. "Thank you," she whispered to Trent. "For what?" he murmured, half asleep. "For everything. For saving me. For loving me. For giving me this life." Trent kissed her forehead. "You saved me too, you know. I was just going through the motions before you. You gave me purpose again, something to build toward that was not just about making up for the past." "We saved each other then," Teresa said. "We did," Trent agreed, "and we will spend the rest of our lives being grateful for it." The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. Sarah grew into a bright, fearless child who loved the ranch and the mountains as much as her parents did. She learned to ride almost before she could walk properly, and by age 5, she was helping Trent with small chores around the ranch. When Sarah was 3, Teresa gave birth to their son, who they named Michael after Trent's father, who had died when Trent was young, but who Trent remembered as a good and gentle man. Michael was quieter than his sister, more thoughtful but just as loving. 2 years after Michael came another daughter, Emma, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn determination. The cabin, which had once seemed spacious for two, now rang with the laughter and occasional arguments of three energetic children. Trent expanded the cabin, adding two more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch prospered under his careful management and Teresa's meticulous record keeping. They hired additional hands during the busy seasons and became known throughout the territory for the quality of their cattle and horses. But success never changed them. They remained the people they had always been: hardworking, honest, generous to those in need. They took in Mrs. Henderson when her arthritis became too severe for her to run the boarding house, and she lived with them for the last 5 years of her life, a beloved grandmother figure to the children. Teresa sometimes thought about that morning in the trading post, about how close she had come to a very different life. She would look at her husband working with the horses, or watch him teaching their son to fix a fence, or see him reading bedtime stories to their daughters, and she would feel overwhelmed with gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Trent Foster through that door at exactly the right moment. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Trent took Teresa back to the spot where he had first told her he loved her. The children were home with Carl, who had become like an uncle to them. And for one evening, Teresa and Trent were just themselves again, not parents or ranchers, but simply two people who had found each other against all odds. They sat on the porch steps of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved, and Trent took Teresa's hand in his. "Do you remember what I said to you that day in the trading post?" he asked. "You said a lot of things," Teresa replied, smiling. "I told you that you were free and that the choices ahead were yours alone. I told you not to let anyone take that from you again." "I remember." "I hope you still feel that way," Trent said seriously. "Free. That being my wife has not felt like a different kind of prison." Teresa turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Trent Foster, being your wife has been the greatest freedom of my life. You gave me the freedom to be myself, to build something meaningful, to love and be loved without fear or conditions. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. How could that ever feel like a prison?" "I just needed to know," Trent said, "that you are happy, that you do not regret the life we have built." "I regret nothing," Teresa said firmly. She cupped his face in her hands, looking into the amber eyes she had loved for 10 years. "You are the best decision I ever made. You and our children and this ranch. This is everything I never knew I wanted. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Trent pulled her close and kissed her with the same passion he had shown on their wedding night. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "What are you thinking?" Teresa asked. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Trent said. "That I walked into that trading post planning to buy some tack and walked out with my entire future." $75 well spent, Teresa teased. "The best investment I ever made," Trent agreed, and they both laughed. As the stars began to appear overhead, they sat together in comfortable silence, hands entwined. Somewhere in the house they could hear their children's laughter, and from the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and the creek sang its endless song. This was home, Teresa thought. Not just the physical place, but this feeling of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. She had been sold like property, stripped of her dignity and her choices, but she had been given them back by a man who understood what it meant to lose everything and to fight to build something new from the ashes. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to the cold, and dry summers when the grass withered and they prayed for rain. There were injuries and illnesses, the normal trials of life on an isolated ranch. But through it all, Teresa and Trent faced everything together, their love deepening with each shared hardship. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman who managed horses with skill that impressed even the most experienced cowboys. She eventually married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who loved the land as much as she did, and they built their own spread in the next valley over. Michael went to college in Denver, studying animal husbandry and modern ranching techniques, and came back to help his father expand the operation. He married a schoolteacher from town, and they built a house on the eastern edge of the Foster property. Emma, the youngest, proved to have a gift for business. She took over the ranch's accounts and began exploring new markets for their cattle, eventually establishing contracts that made the Foster Ranch one of the most prosperous in the region. Through all of it, Teresa and Trent remained the heart of the family. They were the constants, the touchstones that their children and eventually their grandchildren returned to. The original cabin, though expanded many times, still stood at the center of the property, and family gatherings still took place around its big kitchen table. Teresa never forgot where she had come from or how close she had come to losing everything. She used her position to help other women in difficult situations, quietly funding a shelter in Gunnison for women escaping dangerous circumstances. She never told Trent the full extent of her charitable work, but he knew, and he loved her all the more for her quiet compassion. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together the entire community. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to celebrate the couple who had become pillars of their community. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and toast after toast to the Fosters and their enduring love. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone home and their children were cleaning up, Teresa and Trent slipped away to walk down to the creek, just as they had done countless times over the years. The summer night was warm and clear, and the stars spread across the sky in a glittering blanket. They held hands as they walked, their steps slower now than they had been in their youth, but no less sure. 30 years, Teresa marveled. It seems impossible that so much time has passed. Impossible and yet not enough, Trent said. I could live 100 years with you and still want more time. We have been blessed, Teresa said. More than I ever thought possible. They reached the creek and stood listening to the water, the same water that had been singing its song since the day Trent first brought Teresa to this valley. How many times had they stood in this exact spot? How many dreams had been dreamed here? How many promises made? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not walked into that trading post that day? Trent asked. It was a question they had never really discussed, though it had surely crossed both their minds over the years. I try not to, Teresa said honestly. The possibilities are too terrible to contemplate, but I do think about how easily I might have missed this life. If you had come an hour later, if Raymond had sold me to someone who took me far away, if any number of small things had been different. I think we would have found each other somehow, Trent said. I have to believe that some things are meant to be, and we were meant to be. Do you really believe that? Teresa asked. In fate? I believe in you and me, Trent said simply. I believe that from the moment I saw you in those shackles, my life changed direction. Everything I did after that was about building toward a future that included you. So whether you call it fate, or providence, or just dumb luck, the result is the same. We found each other, and we built this life together. Teresa leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. His hair was gray now, and there were lines around his eyes, but to her, he was as handsome as the day they met. More so, because she knew him completely now, knew every part of his heart and soul. I love you, she said. Words she had spoken thousands of times, but which still held all their original power. I love you too, Trent replied. Always have, always will. They stood there for a long time, two people who had started as strangers in the worst of circumstances and had built a love story that had lasted 3 decades. The creek sang around them, the mountains stood watch, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Finally, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, toward the light spilling from the windows and the sound of their children's voices. They walked toward home, toward family, toward all that they had built together from ashes and hope and a single act of compassion that had changed both their lives forever. Years later, when they were both old and their children had children of their own, Teresa and Trent would sit on that same porch and watch the sunset over mountains that had become as familiar as their own faces. They would hold hands and remember everything, the fear, the joy, the hard times, and the good, the whole beautiful tapestry of their shared life. And on a summer evening when Teresa was 72 and Trent was 78, they sat together one last time on that porch. Trent's health had been failing, and they both knew their time was growing short, but there was no fear in it. They had lived fully, loved completely, and built something that would endure long after they were gone. No regrets? Trent asked, his voice weaker than it once was, but still warm with love. Not a single one, Teresa replied, squeezing his hand. You gave me everything, Trent Foster. Freedom, love, family, home. Everything that matters. You gave me the same, Trent said. And you gave me Sarah back in a way. Every time I saw you being brave, being strong, refusing to be broken, I saw my sister in you. It healed something in me that I thought was beyond healing. I hope she knows, Teresa said softly. I hope she knows that her brother became a man she would have been proud of, that he saved someone the way he wished he could have saved her. I think she knows, Trent said. I think she has known all along. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. Their family was gathering inside, children and grandchildren coming to spend time with them, to hear the old stories one more time, to soak up the love that still radiated from this couple who had beaten the odds. I would do it all again, Teresa said suddenly. Every bit of it, even the hard parts, because they led me here, to you, to this life. So would I, Trent agreed. Every single day, every choice, every moment, all of it was worth it for this. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, their youngest granddaughter came out to fetch them for dinner. She was 8 years old, bright and curious, and she had been named Teresa after her grandmother. Grandma, Grandpa, are you coming? Mom says dinner is ready. Trent stood slowly, his joints stiff with age, but his spirit still strong. He helped Teresa to her feet, and together they followed their granddaughter inside, toward the warmth and light and love that filled their home. Trent passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, Teresa's hand in his and his family surrounding him. He went with a smile on his face, and his last words were to tell Teresa that he loved her and that he would wait for her. Teresa lived another 4 years, watching over the ranch and her family with the same strength and grace she had always shown. She told her grandchildren stories about their grandfather, about the day he saved her in a trading post in Gunnison, about the life they had built together in the shadow of the mountains. She made sure they understood that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, made new every day, and that kindness could change the course of a life. When Teresa finally followed her husband, it was on a warm spring morning, very much like the morning their first daughter had been born. She slipped away surrounded by family, in the bedroom she had shared with Trent for more than 50 years, with the sound of the creek singing outside the window. Her children found a letter among her things, written in her careful handwriting and addressed to all of them. In it, she told them the full story of how she and their father had met, holding nothing back. She wanted them to know where she had come from, what she had survived, and how their father's single act of compassion had not just saved her life, but had given her a life worth living. She ended the letter with words that became something of a family creed, passed down through generations. We cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. We can choose courage over fear, love over bitterness, hope over despair. Your father chose to see a person where others saw property, and that choice changed everything. Remember this when you face your own hard choices. Remember that one act of kindness, one moment of courage, can ripple out in ways you cannot imagine. Choose love. Choose compassion. Choose to be the person who walks through the door at exactly the right moment and changes everything. That is how we honor the life we have been given. That is how we build something that lasts. The Foster Ranch continued to thrive for generations, each new generation adding their own chapter to the family story. But at the heart of it all, remembered in stories and family lore, was the tale of Trent and Teresa, the cowboy and the woman he freed, who found love in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a legacy that would endure. And in Gunnison, Colorado, if you walk down the main street even today, you will find a small plaque on the building that once housed McKinnon's trading post. It reads simply, "In memory of all those who found freedom and new beginnings in the American West. May we never forget those who were bought and sold, and may we honor those who chose compassion over profit, love over law, and humanity over all else." It was placed there by the Foster family in honor of a moment that changed not just two lives, but the course of history for an entire family. It stands as a reminder that in the darkest moments, there is still hope, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a single act of courage by a stranger who chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. Trent and Teresa Foster lived their love story fully, from that fateful morning in June of 1876 to their final days together more than half a century later. They proved that love can grow from trauma, that healing is possible, and that two people who choose each other every day can build something beautiful from even the most broken beginnings. Their story became legend in the Foster family, the story of how Grandpa Trent walked into a trading post to buy tack and walked out having traded everything he had to set Grandma Teresa free, and how that freedom became the foundation for a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that would endure for generations. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of love story the Wild West was made for: dramatic, heartfelt, and ultimately redemptive. A story of darkness transformed into light, of desperation turned to hope, of two lost souls who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to build a life together that honored both their pain and their possibility. And somewhere in that high valley in Colorado, where the creek still sings and the mountains still stand watch, their story lives on a testament to the power of love, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with a single act of unexpected grace.